The helicopter blades cut through the darkness above the Red Sea, and Lieutenant Commander Yoav Har Evan checked his watch one final time. 3 minutes to insertion. Below him, 1,500 kilometers from Israeli waters, the Panama-flagged merchant vessel Close Sea plowed steadily through international waters, its crew completely unaware that 18 Shayatit, 13 commandos, were about to drop onto their deck. Har Evan's earpiece crackled with the final confirmation from INS Hunnet, the missile corvette shadowing the operation from just beyond visual range. The Close Sea's crew numbered 17. Intelligence suggested none of them were armed. Intelligence also suggested the cargo hold contained 40 Syrian-manufactured M302 rockets hidden under cement bags, each rocket capable of striking Tel Aviv from Gaza. But intelligence had been wrong before. The first commando's boots hit the deck at exactly 0 Tazet T 2:30 hours on March 5th, 2014. No gunfire, no resistance, just the mechanical hum of the ship's engines and the surprised shouts of crew members jerking awake in their quarters. Within 4 minutes, Shayatet 13 controlled the bridge, the engine room, and every access point to the cargo hold. The Panamanian flag came down, the Israeli flag went up. And Lieutenant Commander Har Evan stood in the cargo hold, staring at hundreds of cement bags stacked floor to ceiling in shipping containers, wondering if his unit had just executed a flawless commando operation on the wrong ship. 3 weeks earlier, nobody in Israeli naval intelligence was thinking about cement bags or merchant vessels or the Red Sea. Captain Danny Roth sat in a windowless office in Tel Aviv, scrolling through routine shipping manifests the way he'd done for the past 8 months. Iranian maritime activity, commercial vessels departing Bandar Abbas, standard surveillance work, boring work. Until the Close Sea appeared on his screen with a route that made absolutely no commercial sense. The ship had loaded cargo in Iran, made an additional stop in Qasr, Iraq, and was now heading south toward the Red Sea. Destination listed as Port Sudan. Captain Roth had been tracking Iranian shipping long enough to know that legitimate cargo vessels don't take this route unless they're trying to hide something. He flagged the ship in the system and kept watching. Over the next 72 hours, the Close Sea became the most analyzed merchant vessel in the Israeli intelligence database. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual about the ship itself. A standard bulk carrier, 12,000 tons, built in 2002, flying a Panamanian flag of convenience. The crew manifest listed 17 sailors from various countries, none with known ties to Iranian intelligence or Hezbollah. The cargo manifest declared cement, tiles, and construction materials bound for Sudanese buyers. Everything appeared legitimate. Everything except the route. And everything except the fact that Iranian signals intelligence had gone suddenly quiet about shipping departures from Bandar Abbas exactly 1 week before the Close Sea left port, which meant someone in Tehran wanted this particular shipment to move invisibly. Major General Ram Rothberg commanded the Israeli Navy's interdiction operations, and he understood the political mathematics of boarding ships in international waters far from Israeli territory. If they were wrong about the Close Sea, if they boarded a civilian merchant vessel and found only cement, the diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic. Israel would be accused of piracy, Iran would leverage the incident at the United Nations, and the entire intelligence apparatus would be exposed as trigger-happy and unreliable. But if they were right, and they let the ship reach Port Sudan, 40 long-range rockets would disappear into the African smuggling networks, and eventually surface in Gaza, where they'd be aimed at Israeli cities. Rothberg needed more evidence before he could authorize an interdiction 1,500 kilometers from home. The evidence arrived in pieces over the following week. A signals intercept from Iranian Revolutionary Guard communications mentioned a high-value cargo requiring special handling. An informant in Bandar Abbas port reported unusual security around specific containers loaded onto the Close Sea. Satellite thermal imaging detected temperature variations in the cargo hold consistent with metal objects rather than cement. And a CIA liaison officer shared intelligence suggesting Iran had redirected weapons originally meant for Hezbollah in Lebanon, toward alternative recipients after Syrian civil war complications made the traditional overland routes too risky. The alternative recipient was Hamas in Gaza. The delivery method was maritime smuggling through Sudan, and the Close Sea was the delivery vessel. Major General Rothberg brought the intelligence package to Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Benny Gantz, who brought it to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The decision came back within 18 hours. Intercept the Close Sea, bring the ship to Eilat, document everything, and make sure the entire world sees what's inside those cargo containers, because this operation wasn't just about stopping rockets. It was about exposing Iran's maritime smuggling networks during the middle of sensitive international nuclear negotiations. The operation received its codename, Full Disclosure. The name wasn't accidental. It was information warfare before the commandos even left port. INS Hanit and INS Hetz, two Sa'ar 5-class missile corvettes, departed Eilat on February 28th. Their official mission was routine naval exercises in the Red Sea. Their actual mission was to shadow the Close Sea without being detected and to provide support for Shayatet 13 when the boarding order came through. The corvettes carried advanced radar systems, helicopter landing platforms, and fast, rigid-hulled inflatable boats designed for exactly this type of operation. They also carried 18 Shayatet 13 commandos, who spent the next 4 days rehearsing the boarding procedure on a similar merchant vessel the Israeli Navy kept for training purposes. The commandos practiced night insertions, simultaneous multi-point entries, non-lethal crew control, and rapid cargo inspection protocols. They practiced until every movement was automatic, because when you're boarding a ship in international waters in the dark, 1,500 kilometers from friendly territory, there's no room for improvisation. The Close Sea had no idea it was being hunted. The ship maintained steady speed and course, following its declared route toward Port Sudan, while Israeli naval intelligence tracked every mile through satellite coverage and radar telemetry from INS Hanit. The two Israeli corvettes maintained position just beyond the horizon, close enough to intercept within minutes, but far enough to avoid visual detection by the merchant vessel's crew. The closer the Close Sea came to Sudanese territorial waters, the narrower Israel's window for action became. International law permitted interdiction in international waters under certain circumstances, but those circumstances required solid evidence and careful legal justification. Once the ship crossed into Sudan's territorial waters, Israeli warships couldn't follow without triggering a diplomatic crisis. The timeline was tight and getting tighter. Before we find out how this high-stakes chase ends, I want to let you know that this channel brings you real spy stories and intelligence operations every single day. Not Hollywood fiction, but actual tradecraft, genuine operations, and the real strategic decisions behind the headlines. These are the stories that shaped modern intelligence work, maritime interdiction doctrine, and the ongoing shadow war in the Middle East. If you're fascinated by how intelligence agencies actually operate, how commandos execute missions in international waters, and how one shipping container can trigger a geopolitical confrontation, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what happens when Shayatet 13 finally boards the Close Sea is just the beginning, and the real intelligence value of this operation won't be clear until we get inside those cargo containers. Oh, and real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. It's always amazing to see how far these intelligence stories reach. Are you listening from Washington, Tel Aviv, London, Dubai? Let me know. Now, back to the Red Sea. The Close Sea was running out of international water, and Major General Rothberg was running out of time. On March 4th, with the merchant vessel less than 24 hours from Sudanese territorial waters, Rothberg received final authorization from the Chief of Staff. Operation Full Disclosure was green-lit for execution. The plan was straightforward in theory and complex in practice. Shayatet 13 would launch from INS Hanit in a coordinated helicopter and fast boat insertion at night, board the Close Sea simultaneously from multiple points, secure the crew without casualties, take control of the bridge and engine room, and conduct an immediate preliminary cargo inspection to confirm the rockets were actually aboard. If the rockets were there, the ship would be escorted to Eilat. If the rockets weren't there, the operation would become an instant diplomatic disaster that would haunt Israeli intelligence for years. The commandos loaded into their helicopters and fast boats at 2200 hours on March 4th. Lieutenant Commander Har-Evan briefed his team one final time, emphasizing the rules of engagement: non-lethal force unless absolutely necessary, crew safety as a priority, and immediate reporting once cargo was confirmed. The psychological profile of the close seas crew suggested they were civilian merchant sailors hired through standard maritime employment channels, which meant they probably had no idea they were transporting weapons for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The crew was a tool, not the enemy. The real enemy was the network that put the cargo on board, and the planners in Tehran who assumed Israel wouldn't dare board a civilian vessel this far from home. Es Hanit closed to within 3 kilometers of the close sea at 0100 hours. The night was moonless, which helped to conceal the Israeli warship, but complicated the boarding approach. Shayetet 13 launched in 3 waves, 2 helicopters carrying 12 commandos for the aerial insertion, and 2 fast boats carrying 6 commandos for the waterline approach. The helicopters flew low and fast, their rotor noise blending with the ambient engine sound from the merchant vessel until they were directly overhead. At 0230 hours, the commandos fast roped onto the close seas deck from both helicopters simultaneously, while the waterline teams scaled the hull using magnetic climbing equipment. Total insertion time, 90 seconds. The crew never saw them coming. The bridge was secured first. 2 commandos burst through the door with flashlights and suppressed weapons, finding the night watch officer frozen at the helm and the captain emerging from his quarters in confusion. The commandos moved with rehearsed precision. Captain and watch officer secured with flex cuffs, radio communications disabled, ship's navigation system placed under Israeli control. Within 3 minutes, the bridge belonged to Shayetet 13. Within 6 minutes, the engine room was secured. Within 10 minutes, all 17 crew members were accounted for, restrained, and gathered on the main deck under guard. Not a single shot had been fired. Nobody was injured, and the Panamanian flag was already coming down the mast as the Israeli flag went up in its place. Lieutenant Commander Har-Evan established communication with Major General Rothberg aboard INS Hanit. Ship secured, crew compliant, no resistance. Preliminary assessment suggested the crew genuinely didn't know about the weapons cargo, which aligned with Iranian operational security protocols: compartmentalize information, use civilian cover, maintain plausible deniability at every level. 1 or 2 handlers connected to the shipping agent probably knew the real cargo, but the actual sailors were kept deliberately ignorant. This wasn't cruelty. This was tradecraft. If the crew didn't know, they couldn't reveal anything under interrogation. And if the ship was interdicted, Iran could claim the crew was innocent, and the entire operation was a rogue smuggling attempt unconnected to Tehran. The cargo hold inspection began at 0300 hours. The Yahalom Combat Engineering Unit, specialists in explosive ordnance and concealed weapons, descended into the hold with portable X-ray equipment, thermal scanners, and cargo manifests seized from the bridge. What they found was exactly what Israeli intelligence had predicted: shipping containers stacked with cement bags, hundreds of them, thousands of them, gray industrial cement bags marked with Arabic text and arranged in neat rows that completely filled the visible space. To an untrained observer, it looked like a legitimate construction material shipment. To Yahalom engineers who'd spent years hunting smuggled weapons, it looked like a very expensive game of hide-and-seek. The engineers began the systematic process of container inspection. They started with thermal scanning to detect temperature variations that might indicate metal objects concealed within organic materials. Cement is thermally consistent. Steel rocket casings are not. The first anomaly appeared in Container 7, where thermal imaging showed distinct cold spots, suggesting large metal objects buried under the cement bags. The engineers opened the container, removed the first layer of cement bags, and found exactly what they were looking for: M302 rockets, Syrian manufactured, 40 of them. Each rocket measured roughly 4 meters long and weighed about 150 kilograms. Each rocket had a range of approximately 160 kilometers, and each rocket was capable of striking Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, or Ben Gurion International Airport if launched from Gaza. Lieutenant Commander Har Evan radioed the confirmation to Major General Rothberg at 0415 hours. Cargo confirmed. 40 M302 rockets, multiple containers, weapons concealed under cement bags exactly as intelligence predicted. Rothberg immediately notified the Chief of Staff, who notified the Prime Minister. The operation had just transformed from a risky interdiction into a strategic intelligence victory. Israel had caught Iran red-handed, violating the UN arms embargo, smuggling advanced weapons to militant groups, and using civilian maritime routes to disguise military cargo. And because the seizure happened in international waters with full documentation and witness verification, there was no way for Tehran to deny what had just been exposed. But the rockets themselves weren't the most valuable discovery in the close seas cargo hold. The engineers found something far more important hidden in the ship's administrative compartments: shipping documentation, manifests showing the exact routing of every container loaded at Bandar Abbas. Port Hasora wire handling records from Qasr showing which containers received additional cargo during the Iraqi stop. Insurance documents listing the shipping agent responsible for coordinating the transfer. And internal cargo lists that mapped the entire concealment strategy, showing exactly how the weapons were layered under cement to avoid detection by standard port scanning equipment. This paper trail was pure intelligence gold. It revealed the complete architecture of Iran's maritime smuggling network, the ports they used, the shipping companies they worked with, the routes they preferred, and the concealment methods they relied on. Israeli naval intelligence had just acquired a roadmap to every Iranian weapons shipment moving through commercial maritime channels. The 40 rockets would eventually be displayed at Eilat Port for diplomatic purposes. But the shipping documents would be analyzed by intelligence officers for months, cross-referenced against other surveillance data, and used to identify additional smuggling operations that had nothing to do with the close sea. Some of those future interdictions would be publicly acknowledged. Most would not. The real victory of Operation Full Disclosure wasn't stopping this particular shipment. It was exposing the system. The crew interrogations began while the cargo inspection continued. Each sailor was questioned separately by intelligence officers fluent in multiple languages. The results confirmed the compartmentalization assessment. The captain knew the cargo manifest listed construction materials, but he'd never inspected the containers personally. The first mate had signed off on the cargo loading at Bandar Abbas, but he'd relied on documents provided by the shipping agent. The crew had no reason to believe they were transporting anything illegal, and their confusion during the interrogations appeared genuine. Only 2 individuals showed signs of deeper knowledge: a cargo supervisor who'd been unusually insistent about specific container placement, and a port liaison officer who'd boarded in Qasr and mysteriously departed before the ship left Iraqi waters. Both men were connected to the shipping agent. Both men were almost certainly Iranian Revolutionary Guard operatives using commercial cover, and both men were now safely beyond Israeli reach, having left the ship before it entered the interdiction zone. The sun rose over the Red Sea at 0600 hours on March 5th, and the close sea was already under escort by INS Hanit and INS Hetz, heading north toward Israeli waters. The journey back would take 3 days. During that time, Israeli engineers would continue cataloging every weapon in the cargo hold, intelligence officers would continue interrogating the crew, and the Israeli government would prepare for the diplomatic firestorm that was about to erupt. Because Operation Full Disclosure wasn't just a military operation, it was a carefully choreographed information warfare campaign designed to expose Iran's smuggling networks, embarrass Tehran during sensitive nuclear negotiations, and demonstrate Israeli naval reach to anyone watching from Moscow, Beirut, or Damascus. The M302 rockets discovered aboard the close sea told a story that Israeli intelligence had been piecing together for months. These weapons weren't originally built for Hamas. They were Syrian-manufactured rockets intended for Hezbollah in Lebanon, part of the massive weapons pipeline that had flowed from Damascus to Beirut for decades. But the Syrian civil war had turned that pipeline into a liability. Assad's regime was fighting for survival. Border crossings were contested. Weapons convoys were vulnerable to airstrikes. So Iran did what any adaptable smuggling network does when traditional routes become too risky. It found an alternative customer. Hamas in Gaza needed long-range rockets. Hezbollah's supply chain was compromised. The M302S got repurposed, and the maritime route through Sudan became the new smuggling corridor. This repurposing revealed something important about Iran's weapons distribution strategy. Tehran wasn't loyal to any particular militant group. It was loyal to regional instability. If Hezbollah couldn't receive shipments safely, Iran would send them to Hamas instead. If the Lebanon route was blocked, Iran would pivot to Sudan and smuggle overland through African networks. The goal wasn't ideological solidarity with specific organizations. The goal was maintaining pressure on Israel from multiple fronts simultaneously, ensuring that no matter where Israeli intelligence focused its attention, weapons would flow somewhere else. Operation Full Disclosure had disrupted one shipment on one route, but it hadn't solved the strategic problem. It had just exposed how flexible and resilient the smuggling network actually was. The cement concealment method used aboard the Close Sea was deliberately unsophisticated, and that choice revealed something about Iranian confidence. The cement bags weren't advanced camouflage. They weren't chemically treated to defeat X-ray scanning. They weren't arranged in patterns designed to confuse thermal imaging. They were just cement bags stacked on top of rockets. This worked on two assumptions. First, that no one would physically board the ship and manually inspect the cargo, because boarding civilian vessels in international waters carried enormous diplomatic risk. Second, that even if the ship was scanned at a port, the density of cement would obscure the metal signatures underneath. Both assumptions reflected a kind of operational complacency within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force Logistics Division. They'd been running maritime smuggling operations successfully for years. They'd become confident, maybe overconfident, that legal constraints and diplomatic hesitation would protect their shipments better than any technical concealment method. That overconfidence gave Israeli planners a critical advantage. If Iran believed boarding was unlikely, then boarding became the most effective countermeasure. If Iran relied on legal and diplomatic barriers rather than armed defense, then Israeli commandos could execute interdictions with minimal risk of casualties. Operation Full Disclosure proved this calculus worked. Shayatet 13 had boarded the Close Sea without encountering a single armed guard, without facing any resistance beyond confusion and compliance. The greatest protection Iran had built around this weapon shipment wasn't military. It was psychological. And once Israel decided to ignore the diplomatic risks and board the ship anyway, that psychological barrier collapsed instantly. The Close Sea arrived at Eilat Port on March 8th, 3 days after the interdiction. The ship was immediately placed under Israeli control, and the weapons were unloaded under heavy security while international media crews gathered at the port entrance. This wasn't a routine evidence collection process. This was political theater. The Israeli government had invited foreign military attachés, diplomats, and UN observers to witness the cargo inspection firsthand. Journalists were given access to photograph the rockets lined up on the dock. Government officials held press conferences explaining the seizure's significance. Every detail was choreographed for maximum diplomatic impact. The message wasn't aimed at Israeli citizens who already supported their government's counterterrorism operations. The message was aimed at Washington, Brussels, and the UN Security Council, where negotiations over Iran's nuclear program were reaching critical stages. The timing of Operation Full Disclosure wasn't coincidental. Israeli intelligence had known about the Close Seas cargo for weeks before the interdiction. They could have boarded the ship earlier, closer to Iranian waters, when the operational risks were lower, but they waited. They waited until the diplomatic calendar aligned perfectly, until the weapons seizure would generate maximum pressure on Iran during nuclear negotiations, until the revelation would reinforce Israeli arguments that Tehran couldn't be trusted to honor international agreements. The 40 rockets were evidence in a much larger case Israel was building against Iranian compliance with any future nuclear deal. And the Eilat port exhibition was the prosecution's opening statement. Iran's response was immediate and predictable. Foreign Ministry spokesman Ramin Mehmanparast called the Israeli claims baseless fabrications, insisted Iran had no connection to the close sea or its cargo, and accused Israel of piracy and propaganda. The denial was emphatic and comprehensive, which was exactly what Israeli planners expected. Tehran couldn't acknowledge the weapons shipment without admitting it was violating the UN arms embargo. But the denial also rang hollow when placed alongside the physical evidence: 40 Syrian-manufactured rockets with documented shipping routes from Iranian ports. International observers could draw their own conclusions about which side was telling the truth. The United Nations Security Council commissioned an expert panel to investigate the incident. The panel's work took months, involving interviews with crew members, analysis of shipping documents, and forensic examination of the weapons themselves. The final report, released later in 2014, confirmed several key facts. The weapons originated from Iran. The shipment violated UN Security Council resolutions prohibiting Iranian arms transfers. The M302 rockets were Syrian-manufactured but had transited through Iranian territory before being loaded aboard the close sea. And the shipping route through Sudan was designed to obscure the cargo's origin and destination. However, the panel noted one important caveat. While Israel claimed the weapons were destined for Gaza, the documented endpoint was Port Sudan. The panel couldn't definitively establish what would have happened after the weapons reached Sudan, whether they would have continued to Gaza as Israel asserted or remained in Sudan for other purposes. This ambiguity was strategically useful for multiple parties. Israel could point to the UN panel's confirmation of Iranian involvement as vindication of the interdiction. Iran could point to the panel's inability to prove Gaza as the destination as evidence that Israeli claims were exaggerated. And Sudan could maintain plausible deniability about its role as a transit hub, claiming it was an innocent victim of smugglers using its ports without authorization. The truth, as usual in intelligence operations, was more complex than any single narrative could capture. The weapons were almost certainly bound for Gaza eventually, but the route was deliberately designed with multiple contingencies and deniable waypoints. If the shipment was intercepted before reaching Sudan, Iran could deny involvement. If it was intercepted in Sudan, Tehran could blame rogue smugglers. And if it reached Gaza successfully, the weapons would appear with no clear attribution to Iranian logistics networks. The diplomatic fallout from Operation Full Disclosure extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. The operation demonstrated Israeli naval capabilities at extreme range, sending a message to Iran and Hezbollah that maritime smuggling routes weren't safe even in international waters far from Israeli territory. It exposed Sudan's role as a willing or negligent transit hub for weapons smuggling, putting pressure on Khartoum to reform its port security or face international consequences. And it complicated the broader nuclear negotiations by providing concrete evidence that Iran was simultaneously pursuing weapons proliferation while claiming it wanted diplomatic resolution. Western diplomats who were pushing for a negotiated nuclear deal now had to address Israeli concerns that any agreement with Tehran would be violated just as systematically as the arms embargo was being violated aboard the close sea. But here's the part of Operation Full Disclosure that rarely gets discussed in public reporting. The strategic value of the interdiction wasn't really about the 40 rockets. Hamas would eventually acquire long-range rockets through other means. The smuggling networks would adapt. New routes would be established. The tactical denial of this particular shipment was temporary and relatively minor in the broader context of weapons flows into Gaza. The real strategic value was something Israeli naval intelligence understood from the moment they opened those shipping containers and found the documentation inside. They'd just acquired a complete map of Iranian maritime smuggling architecture. The ports, the shipping companies, the concealment methods, the transit routes, the timing protocols. And that map would be worth far more than 40 rockets. Over the following 2 years, Israeli naval intelligence used the Close Sea documentation to identify and track dozens of additional Iranian weapons shipments moving through commercial maritime channels. Some of those shipments were interdicted publicly. Most were not. Some were allowed to continue under surveillance to identify additional network nodes. Some were disrupted through pressure on shipping companies or port authorities rather than through direct military action. And some simply disappeared in unexplained maritime incidents that were never officially attributed to any particular intelligence service. The networks that moved weapons aboard the Close Sea found themselves systematically compromised, their methods exposed, their vulnerabilities mapped, and they never knew exactly how much Israel had learned from that one seizure. I have to pause here and ask you something. If you were the intelligence officer who first spotted the Close Sea's suspicious routing and had to decide whether to recommend boarding a civilian vessel in international waters based on incomplete evidence, knowing that being wrong would create a massive diplomatic crisis and potentially end your career, would you have made the call? The evidence was suggestive, but not definitive. The political risks were enormous. The operational challenges were significant, but the potential intelligence value, if you were right, could reshape the entire regional smuggling network for years. Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how you'd navigate that impossible decision, because the intelligence officer who flagged the Close Sea took a career-defining risk that could have gone very wrong, and his decision ended up exposing an entire weapons proliferation network. Here's what happened next. The Close Sea and its crew were eventually released after the cargo inspection was complete and the crew interrogations were finished. The ship returned to commercial service under its Panamanian flag, though it's unlikely any Iranian shipping agent ever used that particular vessel again. The crew members were cleared of criminal charges. Israeli authorities determined they were genuinely unaware of the weapons cargo and had been used as unwitting participants in the smuggling operation. The sailors returned to their home countries with an interesting story about being detained by Israeli commandos in the middle of the Red Sea, though many of them probably still don't fully understand what they were actually transporting or why it mattered. The M302 rockets seized from the Close Sea were destroyed by Israeli military specialists after being thoroughly documented and displayed. Some components were retained for intelligence analysis and training purposes. The rockets represented a significant capability leap for Hamas. 160-kilometer range would have put Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and most of central Israel within striking distance from Gaza. Israeli military planners had to assume that Hamas would eventually acquire similar weapons through alternative smuggling routes, which meant missile defense systems and civilian warning infrastructure would need to be prepared for long-range threats. Operation Full Disclosure had bought time, but it hadn't eliminated the strategic challenge. The operational lessons from the Close Sea interdiction reshaped Israeli naval doctrine in ways that are still classified but can be inferred from subsequent operations. Israeli naval intelligence shifted toward earlier intervention based on shipping anomalies rather than waiting for definitive proof of weapons cargo. The emphasis moved from hardware seizure to documentation collection, recognizing that paper trails and network mapping produce longer-term strategic value than tactical weapons denial. And cooperation with non-regional navies increased dramatically, with Israeli intelligence sharing maritime surveillance data with international partners in exchange for broader tracking coverage of Iranian shipping movements. The goal was no longer to intercept every weapons shipment personally. The goal was to make maritime smuggling so risky and so compromised that Iran would be forced back towards more vulnerable land routes or more expensive air transport methods. Major General Ram Rothberg, who commanded the operation, later reflected that the hardest part of full disclosure wasn't the military execution. Shayatet 13 had trained for exactly this type of maritime interdiction. The boarding went smoothly. The crew was cooperative. The weapons were found. The challenging part was the intelligence decision-making process before the operation was authorized. How much evidence is enough to justify boarding a civilian vessel in international waters? How do you balance operational security against the need to brief political leadership? How do you time the interdiction to maximize strategic impact beyond the immediate weapon seizure? These were intelligence problems, not military problems, and they required a different kind of precision than commando operations. The story of Operation Full Disclosure is usually told as a successful military interdiction. Israeli commandos board a ship, find the weapons, bring everything to port, and expose Iranian smuggling. That's accurate but incomplete. The more revealing story is about what happened after the commandos left the cargo hold. The intelligence analysts who spent months tracking additional shipments based on the close sea documentation. The diplomatic officers who leveraged the seizure during nuclear negotiations. The policymakers who used the incident to justify increased maritime surveillance budgets and expanded naval authorities. The operation succeeded tactically because Shayatet 13 is exceptionally well trained, but it succeeded strategically because Israeli intelligence understood that modern warfare isn't just about stopping weapons. It's about exposing networks, shaping perceptions, and creating persistent intelligence advantages that compound over time. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of the most strategically significant naval interdictions of the past decade. This channel is dedicated to bringing you real intelligence operations, actual tradecraft, and the strategic decisions that shaped modern counterterrorism and maritime security. These aren't Hollywood narratives. These are the real operations that map the ongoing shadow war in the Middle East and beyond. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We're covering intelligence operations from every major service, from Cold War classics to contemporary cyber warfare. But this story isn't quite over yet. There's one final revelation about Operation Full Disclosure that changes how we should think about maritime interdiction in the modern era. So, what do you think? Was Operation Full Disclosure primarily about stopping rockets from reaching Gaza? Or was it always an intelligence collection operation disguised as a tactical interdiction? Was the diplomatic timing justified, or should Israel have acted earlier to reduce political complexity? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these strategic intelligence operations. The real lesson of the Close Sea isn't about what Israel stopped, it's about what Israel learned. The 40 M302 rockets were expendable from Iran's perspective. The Revolutionary Guard had other weapons, other routes, other shipments already in progress. Losing this particular cargo was an operational setback, not a strategic defeat. But losing the shipping documentation, exposing the maritime networks, revealing the concealment methods, and having the entire smuggling architecture mapped by hostile intelligence, that was a strategic defeat that took years to recover from. Modern intelligence operations increasingly function this way. The immediate tactical objective, stopping one shipment, is secondary to the broader intelligence objective, exposing the entire system. The seizure is just the opening move. The real operation begins after the cargo hold is secured. And that brings us back to Captain Dani Roth, the Israeli naval intelligence officer who first flagged the Close Sea's suspicious routing 3 weeks before the interdiction. He didn't know at the time that his instinct about a shipping anomaly would lead to one of the most strategically valuable maritime seizures in Israeli history. He was just doing routine surveillance work, scrolling through manifests, looking for patterns that didn't make sense. That's how most intelligence victories actually happen, not through dramatic moments of revelation, but through patient analysis, pattern recognition, and the willingness to flag anomalies even when the evidence is incomplete. Captain Roth took a professional risk by escalating the Close Sea to higher authorities based on circumstantial indicators. If he'd been wrong, he would have wasted resources and damaged his credibility. But he was right. And because he was right, Israeli intelligence spent the next 2 years dismantling Iranian maritime smuggling networks using information that started with one analyst's instinct about a ship that didn't belong on the route it was traveling. Operation Full Disclosure demonstrated that in modern maritime conflict, the decisive blow isn't always the seizure. Sometimes it's the revelation. The weapons are temporary, the networks are strategic, and the intelligence officer who spots the anomaly before anyone else is often more valuable than the commandos who execute the boarding. That's the real story of the Close Sea. Not the dramatic helicopter insertion in the darkness over the Red Sea, though that certainly happened. The real story is what Israeli intelligence did with the shipping documents they found in the cargo hold, and how one interdiction in March 2014 reshaped an entire smuggling architecture that Iran had spent decades building. The 40 rockets were evidence. The documentation was intelligence. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a tactical success and a strategic victory that continues paying dividends years after the operation officially ended.